Okay. Alrighty. Let's jump in here. A fair bit to cover today, I think. Okay, these are all. That was from last time. T-Tracker. What was it? It was a very berry burst from Celestial Seasonings. So it's very citrusy, actually, and berryish. That is my tea du jour. Again, taking from the selection of random tea left behind by grad students of the past. Okay, so jumping right in and getting going quickly here. So last time we obviously talked about, we finished our discussion of work, started talking about families a little bit, went through kind of Rigneris's arguments on marriage. The key kind of idea being marriage is on the decline, and he puts that kind of squarely on a shift in values around marriage, specifically towards a vision of marriage that he calls capstone marriage, right? Marriage as the sort of finishing touch on a more or less completed adult life. So we worked through that argument, right? Looked at a bunch of different things and sort of ended off on a discussion there of, why one of the potential reasons that marriage is declining, which is that men in particular are less economically viable, right? So less marriageable, and that the phenomenon that Rigneris calls cheap sex has allowed men to put off decisions around, forming long-term relationships because they sort of get what they want rather easily. Okay, and then we started off on this last time, right? So this argument specifically about, fertility. So we're going to talk a little bit about fertility or having kids, basically, and why it is declining, right? Why young people, in particular, right, are choosing largely to have fewer children or no children at all. So, right, we kind of established the groundwork here, right? We do know that fertility is collapsing worldwide outside of a few kind of high fertility enclaves. These are becoming fewer and further between, and as we get into I guess we're through the first quarter of the 21st century, and as we get into the second quarter, we're seeing major declines in fertility, and I think far faster than even what has been predicted by demographers. And of course, there's a bunch of conventional explanations for this. Economics, housing, religiosity, contraception, and childcare that Kurtz thinks doesn't actually explain the data, right? So on the economic side, we're just reviewing quickly, there's basically been a whole bunch of economic incentives that people have tried, or countries have tried, in order to increase fertility. Really, none of them have worked particularly well. You've seen maybe in some places temporary increases in fertility, but nothing structural, right? Paying parents, tax incentives, any of those things haven't ultimately worked. And some of the places with the most generous family benefits have some of the lowest fertility on Earth. And I just was looking at the numbers this morning. Finland, which generally is, and the Nordic countries in general, which are generally held as kind of models here, Finland's, fertility is at 1.25, right? So and like Norway's is like 1.3, Sweden's is 1.2, Denmark, I think 1.19, right? So very, very low. And these are countries we generally hold up as models of generous family benefits. Okay, religiosity, right? This is the one that I think is kind of probably most contested. And, I can give you an example in a second as we get through some counterexamples here. But outside of, a few super religious populations, even pretty religious populations tend to struggle to hit replacement fertility, right? Like I said, weekly attending evangelicals, which is a pretty religious group in the United States, hit about 2.0 in terms of fertility. So religiosity plays a role and more religious people are definitely having more children. That said, right, in all of the European countries that report high religiosity, so Greece, Moldova, Romania, and you could add Poland to that list, fertility remains well below replacement and falling all the time. Like I said, I think Poland is about 1.4 children per woman. Okay, and I think did we end off on housing? No, we end off there. Housing, right? This is the housing prices were long held up as a potential kind of barrier to having children. Millennials in particular not being able to afford homes. Kurtz suggests that even as millennial home ownership rates have risen, their fertility rate hasn't risen. But I was looking at some arguments about this morning, and one of the kind of interesting ones is if you look at, say, Canada as an example. So Alberta, where we tend to think of housing as relatively affordable, still only has a, TFR or total fertility rate of about 1.4 children per woman. Saskatchewan, 1.58, which, of Canadian provinces is the highest, right? In Saskatchewan, I've been there, I know how to pronounce it. Saskatchewan, right, has relatively cheap housing by Canadian standards. It's one of the less desirable provinces to live in, and yet its TFR is still well below replacement rate, still a fair bit above Canada's 1.24. So, the lowest in Canada is BC at 1.01 children per woman. So there, and then Ontario is close behind at the average of 1.24 or 1.25. It's slightly above the national average, but not much. So we do see a slight kind of housing effect, maybe in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, but nothing, close to, a huge boost that's statistically significant. Okay, and then I think this is where we ended off, right, talking about the fact that, when it comes to contraception, declines in fertility actually started long before contraception was available. And really, right, only this last part of the graph, in a sense, is really down to contraception, right? Contraception, and the most recent collapse in fertility, right, which happens from 2008 forward in most Western countries. Obviously contraception had been available long before that, but that big drop is really, really hard to explain. Okay, so, I did that recap in 10 minutes, which is better than my typical. Sometimes I'm bad at being concise. Okay, so one of the things, what Kurt suggests is we need an alternate explanation. And I actually think this is reasonably true. And the one that he points to specifically is what I would say is a cultural explanation, which I do like. And he says he thinks the driving factor behind declining fertility is status, right? And essentially how you gain status in society, right? Okay, so from a sociological perspective, what is status, right? Basically, it is your standing as an individual within the group. And, human beings are quite status sensitive, right? We'll talk about this later in the course when it comes to teenagers. Teenagers are very status conscious in terms of things like where they sit in kind of local rankings of their social status. This ends up causing a lot of problems, especially once we get into social media. But that's a discussion for a little bit later. But we're all pretty status conscious, right? We are all involved, basically for the big chunk of our lives in status games, right? In basically, if you want to, you're all too young for this, but once you get there, right, your 25th or 20th or 15th high school reunion, if you attend, there's a lot of status games being played, right, as people compare what their current social status is. Like lots of talking about where you've been on vacation, where you live, what kind of job you have, right, all of that stuff. So Status is our place within formal and informal hierarchies. And yeah, gaining status is generally a motivation for people, right? With very few exceptions, right? We're all playing status games all the time, right? So, and how do you get status? Well, you do it by maintaining approved social behaviors and then through the possession of recognized status symbols, things like titles, wealth, important physical assets, right? All of that stuff is important when it comes to establishing status. So the argument that Kurtz makes, and I think it's a really, really interesting one, which is why I present it, is that what he says is the net, I'm going to highlight it because this is his key argument. The net status outcome, right, of having a child, so the status you gain from having a child is lower than for other things you can do with your time, right? So, for example, pursuing a successful career, right? So there's other things you could do with your time and your energy, and time and energy are things that humans have limited supplies of. So, what does that do to fertility? So he thinks, right, having children is deprioritized for people because it's a relatively low status activity, right? And the title of his piece, which I think is really, again, kind of provocative, is, it's embarrassing to be a stay-at-home mom. And he sort of like games this out as a kind of thought experiment. Like if you were to go to something like a high school reunion, and you're, walking around and talking to the people you went to high school with, he suggests that, right, something like, I'm a lawyer or I'm a doctor or I have this super successful career is going to provide more status than if someone says that they're a stay-at-home mom, which is almost kind of embarrassing, suggesting you've given up, status plays for that domestic role. Okay. So how do we prove this? Hard to prove, obviously. But what he says is, if the pursuit of status is the primary causal factor in suppressing fertility, and I would probably loosen it, a causal factor in reducing fertility, what do we expect to see? Okay, so what we would expect to see is that intervention, so if we have some natural experiments, which increase the status of parents, they should increase fertility. Okay, communities where we see parents, in which parents are of higher status, will have higher fertility, right? High status individuals who become parents will cause others to follow suit. This is a difficult one to prove, right? Because we have to see, an effect of some high status person having children that will then cause other people to have children. Okay, now the other one, social strivers. This one is probably the easiest one to look at. So people who are attempting to increase their status, social strivers, will forego having children or having a smaller number of children for that higher status objective. And status secure people, right? So people who have already made it and are at kind of the highest echelon socially will tend to have higher fertility. Okay. And yeah, groups with unusual status systems will then have unusual fertility patterns, right? And here, this one is probably the easiest to recognize, highly religious communities where piety, right, is more valued than, say, accomplishment, are going to tend to have higher, higher fertility, or where something like having children is a symbol of status. And you can think of like very religious Latter-day Saints, Mormons, as an example of this, right? We see pretty high fertility amongst Mormons, largely because they have a little bit of an odd status system. Ultra-Orthodox Jews, right, especially in places like Israel, like the ultra-Orthodox in Israel have a total fertility rate of 6.6 children per woman. But again, piety there and obedience to religious rules is more important than status. So you see unusual fertility patterns in groups like that. Okay, but let's look at least a couple of these and talk about, so the first one here, interventions which increase the status of parents. So what does that do? Okay, so the case, we'll look here at, again, a kind of a natural experiment, which is Georgia. Now here, Georgia, we mean the country in the southern Caucasus, right? So just kind of, it sits on, south of Russia's southern border, kind of abutting the Black Sea. It's sort of stuck between Russia and the Black Sea. Okay, so Georgia's a little bit of a weird country, right? It is religiously Eastern Orthodox. It has its own very distinct language, which is distinct from, say, Russian or the languages around it. So it's a quite unique society. Historically, right, it was one of the Soviet republics. So it sees a lot of the same fertility declines in the post-Soviet period that were seen in, essentially all of the post-Soviet republics. And it's a very interesting natural experiment because in the mid-2000s, its fertility spikes, right? And it actually manages to go from relatively low, like I believe at about 1.7 children per woman, to above replacement fertility, and it's basically stayed there, right? So I think, in 2025, the recorded TFR was 2.0, so not quite replacement fertility, but very, very close, right? And what a lot of people have pointed to, and this is the example that Kurtz points to as the cause, is a particular intervention by a prominent Georgian figure. And here, the patriarch of the Georgian Orthodox Church, kind of like, not an exact analog, but kind of similar to, say, the Archbishop of Canterbury in England or the Pope, right? But not quite the Pope, like a little bit a step down from that religiously. So the patriarch of the Georgian Orthodox Church, I have Russia on the brain for some reason. The Georgian Orthodox Church, Ilya II, announced that he would baptize and become godfather to all third children and onward, right? So every third child that a couple had, he would baptize them personally, and he would become the godfather to that child. And what happened in Georgia is births of third children boomed. Now again, it didn't make every couple or every woman have 3 children, but it basically moved enough families going from 2 children, well, essentially from no children to 1 child to 2, and then 2 children to 3. Probably a lot of people are like, oh yeah, we'll have 3 children, and then they had the second one, and they were like, nah, this is good. But that kind of intervention sort of prompted people to consider having more children. And so, its birth rate increased by 28%, right? So this, Kurtz said, has widely been understood by political scientists and sociologists as a religious phenomenon, right? People responding to a religious impulse, but he actually thinks it's a status phenomenon. And here, I actually think this is a good analysis because in a way, right, Ilya, in this relatively small country, Georgia's maybe 4.5 million people, not a very big country, Ilya is a prominent figure, right? He's an important figure, and the Orthodox Church is really deeply tied to Georgian identity. So he's kind of a celebrity. And if he is the godfather of your child, right, you're connected to that celebrity, right? So you suddenly have, a little bit higher status because you can say, right, well, we've met Ilya, he's the, godfather to our third child, and all of that stuff, right? So I always put it like this, right? If in Edmonton, Connor McDavid or Leon Draisaitl was like, I will be godfather to every third child and on, you would probably see a lot of people, having third children just because of this same phenomenon, right? Except, of course, godfather is a little bit of a religious phenomenon at all. And so what Kurtz argues is that people tend to emulate celebrities, right? Or follow the lead of celebrities, at least sometimes. So being connected to Ilya is a status symbol. Okay. Okay, T tracker. Since having high achieving children can increase status, would that encourage having children but only one or two so you can prioritize them? Yes, that is actually, sorry, I'm going to fast forward a little bit because that is sort of the argument here, right? I think, right? So having, a high achieving child confers more status benefits than just having a child. So basically, to answer this question, every parent essentially outside of like the status secure is resource limited. So, making a child high achieving, if you want your child to be high achieving, you're likely to have fewer children and pour more resources into that child. So precisely there, basically here we're talking about elite education. So sending your child to somewhere like Harvard or Yale or even the University of Toronto. No, that one doesn't count. Right? Would potentially, in a society where that's very important, could potentially depress fertility rates as well. Okay. So I'll go back. So your question is good, but ahead of what I wanted to talk about. So now we can skip that part. All right, Mongolia. So Mongolia sort of addresses point number 2, right? Communities where parents are of higher status have higher fertility. And we can look here at the example of Mongolia, right? Have you thought about Mongolia recently? I have, but only for this class. Mongolia. Mongolia is a weird country, right? It is sandwiched right here between, Siberia and different parts of China, right? So it's really isolated. It's in a lot of ways, right? It has its own very distinct language. Its alphabet is partially borrowed from Russian, and it's also pretty culturally isolated. It's not a geopolitically sort of very strategic or important country, so like the West hasn't paid much attention to it. So a lot of like Western values haven't worked their way into Mongolia. It's very, very unique, very, very interesting country. Now, fertility in Mongolia, is really interesting because it has declined, from its historic highs in like the 1960s and 70s, which was about 5.56 children per woman. It remains somewhere between 2 and 3 times higher than its neighbors, right? So if you're looking at, I guess Russia today is 1.5 children per woman, although these eastern parts of Russia are lower because it's quite poor. And China is pretty low. You see the different regions of China here, right? All well below the Mongolian number. And what Kurt says is Mongolia, like it's not that different, right? What we would maybe see is if a country is still relatively rural and agricultural in terms of, or agrarian in its economy, what you would see is obviously higher fertility because more farmers, children are useful in terms of labor, but it's not. It's comparatively developed to its northern and southern neighbors, right? It's not obviously quite as rich as China, but it's still, relatively modern in its economy. It's highly urbanized, right? It is, the population is quite urbanized, and it is primarily Buddhist and non-religious. So Buddhism doesn't have a particular predilection towards high fertility in the way, say, maybe Catholicism or Mormonism does. And yet, its fertility remains really high. And the thing that Kurtz points to, and it's this interesting thing that a few people will point to when it comes to Mongolia and its relatively high fertility, is that large families are publicly celebrated, right? That large families are held up as a social good. So every year, I always find this one funny, the president of Mongolia goes around the country and he sort of, goes to every big city and larger towns and stops at their kind of city hall structure, which is always funny because when you look at the pictures, they always have, this imposing Soviet-looking building and then a statue of Genghis Khan. That's like all of them. It's like, what does Mongolia care about? Genghis Khan. A lot of Genghis Khan love in Mongolia. And he goes around and he gives an award to mothers specifically who have 4 children or more, and they get and I kid you not, this is the actual name, the Order of Maternal Glory, right? And they get this medal from the president, and they do get some money. They get about $60, right? And I only mention that because, like, the financial inducement of $60 is not likely to get people to have that many more children. Okay, so that's that. Oh, I have to go back. I have to tell you one thing, and I'm going to do this really quickly, because I forgot one thing, and it's the one that I didn't talk about on this list. But I was thinking about this morning. Why? Don't ask. This is what sociologists do. Childcare. This is a really interesting one that Kurtz doesn't really deal with, but I do think is really interesting. One of the things that has long been argued is that access to, cheaper or universal childcare would raise fertility rates because it would give parents and mothers especially the ability to, return to the workforce more easily at lower costs. This explanation also fails, and it has a very beautifully Canadian kind of angle, because the great example of this not working is Quebec, right? Quebec is a super interesting example of this because in 1997, Quebec brought in a system of $5 per day childcare, or daycare, right? So parents would, and we now have this system sort of established nationally, right, where we're getting cheaper childcare with federal and provincial subsidies. Now, Quebec's total fertility rate is slightly higher than the national average, right? So the national average is about 1.24. Quebec's is somewhere at about 1.32, if I remember the number correctly. So it's slightly higher than the national average. But weirdly, what paid cheap childcare did was actually not increase Quebec's fertility. I guess it increased it a little bit, but what it seems to have done is it incentivized younger women to have children earlier, right? And women who already had one child to consider having a second one. But in older mothers, it actually seems to have discouraged having a second child, right? That basically, they had a child, they put them in daycare really quite early, right? Usually after, 1 year to 18 months. And they had taken that time off of work. Then they went back to work, and most Quebecois women then didn't have a second child. And from kind of qualitative data, it seems to be that, once they'd done the process once and gone out of the workforce and back into the workforce, they saw, a second child as really derailing their career trajectory more than anything else. So just having cheap childcare, widely available, pretty widely dispersed, high quality by Canadian standards of childcare, doesn't seem to have boosted fertility in Quebec meaningfully, right? A little bit, but again, nowhere near, boosting it back to fertility. Is the $60 reward Canadian or Mongolian? So that's US dollars, right? So it's roughly speaking in US dollars, but $60 American, in even if you convert it to whatever currency Mongolia uses, and I can't remember the name of their currency, it's still not a lot of money, right? It's not, I'll put it this way. If Hungary is willing to pay you, or Poland is willing to pay you, $600 US a month for each child until they get to the age of 18, a one-time $60 payment, and that doesn't work, right? That doesn't increase fertility. A one-time $60 payment is unlikely to really induce you to have a child, right? Given how, I want to say taxing, I love my kids, but children are relatively expensive, and they consume resources, a lot more resources than $60 is going to get you. Okay, sorry, I wanted to talk about that because I saw that today, and I was working on stuff today, and I came across this argument. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Okay, so the opposite, right? And again, this is to, maybe instead of zipping forward, I'll jump back to the slide I want. Right? Social strivers, right? So if we talk about our social strivers, we'll forgo children for higher status objects. And now zip back to where I was. Okay. South Korea. Now, South Korea, again, is a really interesting study. Super low fertility, right? Like, depends on which numbers you're going by. Different places report different ones. But a total fertility rate of somewhere between 0.64 and not 0.84%. So really, 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 really low. All the highest status people in South Korea don't have kids, right? And if we look at, I'm going to play that in a sec. One of the things that makes it really difficult in South Korea is status is a huge component of Korean society, right? So status is really, really important to Koreans. It's a very status-oriented society. And the only way to get status, right? There's very few ways to achieve really high status in Korean society, and because of the way their economy is structured. And one of them is to attend one of their really good schools and then get a job in one of the really big companies in South Korea. The South Korean economy is dominated by these state-linked companies that are, and I always get this where I can never figure out the Korean pronunciation. I think it's pronounced K-balls. But these are, these large horizontally integrated companies. So they do a lot of things that are connected to the state. These are companies like Samsung, LG. Asus is Taiwanese. Kia, Hyundai, right? There's a bunch of them that I can't remember. I want to say BenQ, but again, that could be Taiwanese. But lots of these, big corporations that have a global reach. The way to get high status in Korea is to work for one of them. And not everyone can work for them, obviously. And the further away you get from them, the worse, your status is. So Korean life, for example, is really focused on getting to work for one of these places. And if you have children, or a child more typically, parents sacrifice a huge amount of their, time, energy, and money to try and get their kids into these high status professions, right? So crazy things, right? Like your whole life as a student is spent, basically from the time you enter school till the time you graduate high school, trying to get the perfect score on the national exam is going to help you get a job, a place in one of these universities, and then a job in one of these K-balls. And it's like, there's this one book, The Smartest Kids in the World and How They Got That Way by Amanda Ripley. And she kind of catalogs what South Korean student life is. And it's, sometimes in excess of 15 to 16 hours of being in school or being in tutoring per day for these young people. And things like, to make sure that, the exam isn't disrupted, this big national exam. A lot of things are suspended that day. Some, flights are suspended in and out of the country. And it's also a day where South Korean students and young people are most likely to take their own lives, right? So super status-oriented society, and yeah, parents pour huge resources in, but an increasing number of South Koreans, focus on their own status, understanding what it would take to get a child into these kind of high status professions and schools, are actually forgoing having children altogether. So we've got this phenomenon where the highest status Koreans are essentially all childless. Okay, obviously, outside of Elon Musk, who has 94 children by, 94 women, I think. Not quite that bad, but it's a lot and it's weird. An increasing number of high status people in the US are also childless. Think of Taylor Swift, right? Super high status, childless, right? And we're seeing more of this in US elites. And yeah, I guess she's a prominent celebrity. And yeah, influencer culture, and I'll play a little clip for you here. There's also been a big and kind of noticeable trend of the promotion of child-free living. And I just kind of found a YouTube video and I clipped together a few little bits of it just as an example. I don't know who any of these people are. They're just these random, TikTok influencers who are all talking about being childless.
One of the things that I love. love about being child free is here it is, a random Wednesday. I'm all packed and I'm getting ready to walk through the airport looking like somebody's rich wife. And I'm going to the south of France, baby. I'm flying into Nice and I'm going to Monaco, and I'm meeting another girlfriend that is child free. And we're just out here living our best lives, you guys. These little Bottega glasses, these frames, Eats. I got this coat from Zara, like it's faux fur, but baby, it's still making me look rich, okay? And little Versace tote bag. You know, all the essentials. And while I'm out there, I might do a little shopping, you know, because I only spend my money on me. It's great.
Girl, fuck them kids and fuck you too.
I'm 25 and I don't want kids, and here's why. Number one, I would be a great mom, but a miserable person, and I have one life that I'm trying to live. Why would I want to be miserable? I would love my kid, I would do everything for my kid, and I would probably sacrifice myself any chance I got in the name of my child. If I never have a child, I never have to worry about sacrificing my time, my energy, my money, none of that. Number two, overstimulation. Kids are great, but the thought of having one around when I am sick, tired, want to go out with friends, want to have a moment to myself, sounds like torture. It's just like a toxic relationship. From the outside looking in, you can see how bad it is, but once you're in the inside, you're telling everybody and like, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. And everyone's like looking from the outside, looking in, being like, you look fucking miserable, but you're in it, so you like don't realize how actual shit it is. I'm sure it's not the same as a toxic relationship, but that's what it's giving for me. Three, I'm a firm believer in stress is toxic to the body, because it is. It's proven that stress is toxic to the body. I would be so stressed from having a child that I think I would give myself cancer. If that's possible, I think I would literally get cancer from the stress of having a child. I'm not going through 2 years to get my brain and body back. 2 years minimum is what it takes for a woman to recover mentally and physically, if ever, but 2 years minimum until your hormones go back. We don't know how long we're going to be on this earth. Those could be my last 2 years of life, and I spend them not recognizing my body, not feeling in my right mind, not knowing who I am, sleep deprived, stressed, struggling in my relationship. No, I don't want it. Whatever number I'm on. Kids are freaking disgusting. Like, spitting all the time, constantly sick. I don't want to be sick 24/7. I don't want to have the flu every other week. I don't want to be spit on. I don't want to have boogers wiped on my couch. I don't like the thought of that. Anyways, I have a lot more reasons, most of which I've gathered throughout the last 7 years of being an nanny. I don't know, I've been around kids my whole entire life. The risk versus reward, it's not worth it, in my opinion. It's not. Like, family's beautiful, kids are beautiful. It's definitely a blessing. But also, life is fun, and life can just be fun and stress-free, and you can just spend your life traveling, seeing things, hanging out with friends, taking naps, sleeping when you want, going out, moving. Like, that's also a version of life that is an option if you don't have children, and I choose that. Yeah.
When I knew I didn't want children. I'm a professional girlfriend, and a lot of the videos on here I talk about yes, my clients and my life in the industry. So I have mentioned in a few videos that I do not want children, and I have always known my whole life that I didn't want kids. I have never ever had a maternal bone in my body.
I'm just going to stop it here because I could let it go, but I think you get the point. What is a professional girlfriend, by the way? How does one get a job as a professional girlfriend? Interesting questions abound. Okay, so you get the idea, right? Okay, we did that slide already. All right, let's talk status secure people. So the only group in America, right, that has a replacement fertility or a fertility rate above replacement is the ultra rich, right? Families with an average income of over $1 million. And, you know, well, I know a few rich people. We're probably in this class. I wish I was them sometimes, but I'm not. I just know them. And, you know, they'll always insist, well, I need more money. I'm like, but why? You have 3 houses and a boat. Like, what else do you need? And they're like, well, more security. I'm like, but why? I don't understand rich people. That's probably why I'm not one. It's like, they take risks, and I'm a professor, and I don't do those things. But anyway, yes, it's always like, but I need this. I'm like, no, you don't. They're like, yes, I do. Okay, whatever. Status secure, right? Above $1 million a year. is the only demographic in America that has above replacement fertility, and it's just above, right, 2.15. I mean, except if you take the Amish, which is like 5.2, but that's neither here nor there. The Amish and the ultra-rich are both small communities. From $1 million to $500,000 per year in income, TFR drops to 1.85, right? So still above kind of average fertility in the US, which when this piece was written was 1.787. It's very, I think it's about 1.6 now. So it's down a little bit. But again, they could afford more children. You know, $500,000 is still a lot of money per year, but they're still social strivers, which drives, you know, they want to get up here. They want the two houses in the boat. And that forces their TFR down a bit. Okay, so I'm almost done talking about this. How do you get status? Right? And this is the ultimate question, right? And typically there's a few ways historically that humans get status. One is by dominance games, right? And these are different kinds of, like you could call them status games or ways that people establish status. One of them is dominance, right? It is coerced through force or fear, right? And, you know, historically, you know, this was a pretty efficient way to move up the social ladder, right? If you're a Roman general, you can move into the, you know, you can become Caesar, you know, the emperor by, you know, basically subjugating the Roman Republic to your will. You know, you can be someone like Stalin, who by force, you know, becomes the most powerful person in the Soviet Union, right? If you were the strongest warrior in a tribal society, right, you would have status because you had the ability to exert force on people. Okay, virtue. So historically, right, this was, you know, being especially virtuous, right? You demonstrate the morality of your community at a very high level. You do what you're supposed to, you follow the rules, and you follow the morality, right? Especially if you think of like the Middle Ages, you know, where the Catholic Church was dominant, this would have been a major way to get status. And obviously, success is another way of gaining status. By being really successful, making a lot of money, having a great job, being super educated, making some kind of critical discovery, you can gain success. Now, what Kurt says is, in the pre-Enlightenment era, you know, women mostly got their status from, well, a couple of things. Birth, right? So their social class, but largely and virtue, right? Virginity, piety, motherhood. And what he says is something like virtue and dominance doesn't typically require a trade-off in terms of fertility. You know, since motherhood historically for women was part of a virtue game. But that all changes with the Enlightenment and everything that follows the Enlightenment, right? Because, you know, what you put in place with the Enlightenment is meritocracy, right? Where we start to judge people less by, you know, their class, less by their virtue, right? By what their piety or how well they follow the rules, and more by what they produce and how successful they are. And success is the one type of status system that probably does interfere with fertility because, right, it's a trade-off. Having kids is lower status than success, and to chase success, you really have to have fewer children. So again, I think that's an interesting kind of argument. Okay, so I think this rounds out this section. Oh, I got one other thing here. Parenting is low status, right? And again, this is the question that he kind of poses. And again, it's a sort of thought experiment, right? Like if you were going out and meeting a bunch of people that you hadn't seen in a while, you know, one of the typical questions you get is, what do you do? A good answer to this, one that is going to get people to respect you, right, is to lead with your established career. A bad one is, you know, particularly he thinks, I'm a stay-at-home mom, right? So he contends that our economically driven success regime actually drives down fertility, right? And again, this has real world implications. And like I said, into the future, I think this becomes a big social problem. I think we're not quite there where people are recognizing it as a big social problem outside of a few people, but it's coming, right? I predict, and I'm bad at predicting, but I'm pretty confident about this one. But also, right, just in terms of their own sort of life goals and happiness, according to this poll by Cardis, and there's similar polls in other countries, right? And Cardis is a Canadian polling firm, and they did this poll in October 2024. Half of Canadian women end up having fewer children than they say that they want, right? And the average for, of how many children women say they want in Canada is 2.2, according to this Cardis study. That 0.2 children is going to be messy. Again, that's an average. And, again, our average now in Canada is about 1.24. So there's essentially a whole child missing from what women say they would want in terms of family size. And this is pretty consistent across the developed world, right? The number's almost always around 2, right? In most places, most women say they want or majority of women say they want about 2 children. But increasingly, people are having fewer children than that. Okay. Now, let me make one more really. I did some math this morning because sometimes math is fun. This is not going to be an easy problem to solve, especially if you're thinking of, getting back to kind of replacement fertility as a social goal. Because I did the math, and basically, if you take, so in Canada, women 35 and younger, so 35 and younger, what percentage of women 35 and younger would have to have 3 children in order to get Canada back to replacement fertility? Any guesses? Yeah. 5%? Yeah, the percent. Yeah. You're close. It's 102. 102. So it's impossible, right? The closest we can get, if every single woman in Canada today that's under 35 has 3 children, exactly, right? Naive models. We get to 2.09, so just below 2.1. So it's about 102% of Canadian women would have to have 3 children. Now, obviously, right, we're trending lower, and obviously the women, especially really young, are not fully baked into this model yet, but I would guess we're more towards this rate. So it's essentially almost impossible to get Canada back to replacement fertility with younger millennials and Gen Z, because they're such small cohorts generally. Okay, so doom and gloom, we're all doomed. No, it's just, it will cause a lot of social problems because at a certain point, less workers, less children means less future workers. Less future workers means less people paying into the pensions of elderly people, which means at some point the healthcare system and the pension system probably sort of collapse. Okay, hope for the future. No, this not really. There's a big divide, right, between globally and in the US, and is this FT data? Yeah, so FT did this. FT has been putting out some really interesting graphs lately. So Financial Times out of the UK, putting out some really interesting graphs, and occasionally I'll see them on Twitter and grab them. So if we look at the US, right, TFR for conservatives, 2.4, so above replacement. For progressives, 1.8. Globally, the picture is not quite the same, but still similar, right? Conservatives are basically at replacement, and progressives, trending far lower. So again, if we kind of think that the politics of children are going to mirror the politics of their parents, the likelihood is that as time goes by, because conservatives have more children, society will probably trend in a more conservative direction, right? So, and again, that gap was pretty small back in 1995, right? So not that long ago. And here, what, 1970 something? Really small gap. That gap has been widening over time, right? Okay, so if you ever think like it seems weird that the kids are getting more conservative, well, this could be a result of that. All right, last part of the family section, and I'll try to go through this reasonably quickly. I want to talk a little bit about family structure, right? And here, and its impact on young people, right? So family structure. Why did I circle family? I don't know. Family structure. Okay, now I'll circle structure too. And basically, I'm taking most of this from Melissa Kearney, who's a Notre Dame-based economist. She's really interesting. Her book, The Two-Parent Privilege, right? And the subtitle, I think, tells you what you need to know about the argument she's going to make, how the decline in marriage has increased inequality and lowered social mobility and what we can do about it. Okay, and I mean, I'll say she's very progressive, I think, in her thinking, and her idea is not, more stay-at-home moms, we should ban women from the workplace or anything like that. But she does suggest, right, that marriage is ultimately kind of a social good. Okay, so what she says, really simply, family structure and certain types of family structure in particular, privilege or perpetuates privilege and inequality, right? And the book, she says, meant to put a spotlight on the following things. Over the last 40 years, drastic decline in the share of children living with married parents, right? The share of children living with married parents has been going down. In 2019, it was only, she says, only 63%, down from better than 3/4 in 1980, and this rate, looks like it's set to continue to fall. In 2019, the share of, 84% of children whose mother had a 4-year college degree lived with married parents, right? That was still down from 1980 by about 6%, but way smaller than the share of children whose mothers have only a high school diploma or some college, right? By 2019, 60% of those kids lived with married parents, down 23% from 1980, right? So a huge drop. And again, there's class implications here, right? And again, so what do we see here? 4-year college, right? It's down, but not significantly. For high school, and some college, right, down 23%. And then, for those with less than high school, down from 80% to 57%, right? So again, 23% drop there. Okay. So, I tried to visually redesign this to make it more appealing. I don't know if it worked. So what's been the story for college-educated adults? Well, generally speaking, college-educated adults in the United States have seen increased earnings over recent decades, right? They're actually doing better economically. And their marriage rates have remained pretty high, right? They're still getting married and mostly marrying one another. Most marriage is homologous, right? So it's at the same social level, or hypergamous, right? You're marrying up in social class. Children of college-educated children, she suggests, get a lot of things, right? So they get more resources, and the really important resources here are money, right? Because their parents are wealthier, and there's 2 of them living in the same household, and time, right? That's a clock. If you can't tell, my clocks always look like this. It's always the same time of day too, whenever I draw a clock. Like 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock. It's always 5 o'clock, right? So they enjoy the advantages of these 2 college-educated parents. Those without a college degree, right? Earnings have stagnated. Really, real-world earnings for those without a college degree basically haven't risen in real like in real inflation-adjusted dollars since about 1976, right? So they have about as much purchasing power as people in 1976 had, right? And so they've been stuck for a long time. They get married less, right? So less likely to see marriage as valuable, and they're more likely to set up separate households. And as I'll kind of talk through as we go through this, a lot of this has to do with men, right? And the fact that the men in, adults without a college degree bring either fewer or negative resources to a lot of their relationships. Okay, so there is a college gap in family structures. Those with a four-year college degree more likely to live with both their parents, right? Those without a college degree more likely to live without them. Okay. Are productivity gains keeping up with, or could they keep up with population decline? Oh, you're asking a provocative question. Okay, here's what I'll say. A lot of people are banking on this. Japan in particular, and if we look at Japan is probably like along this kind of demographic cliff that we're looking at. Japan is probably about 20 or 30 years ahead of where Canada is today, right? Because they hit that decline in fertility earlier. And they're really, like, the Japanese government is investing enormously in automation and AI to try and keep that economy productive as population declines. Now, Japan also has other issues. They're super averse to immigration, so they can't use immigration to sort of backfill low fertility. They've tried, and honestly, the population is not having any of it, so that is a big problem. Totalitarian countries are probably better set this way, in the sense that they are, they can just do what they want and their population doesn't matter as much. That said, we've yet to see it, and I'm not optimistic, right? I could go back to the work unit, and if we're talking about Canada, right, Canada being in that lowest quartile of productivity growth, we're not well positioned for that. So it's possible, but I think a lot of people are gambling on the magical power of AI to increase productivity, something that we have not yet seen, and it could happen. But I'm not optimistic, right? I actually don't know that this is going to be enough, and I think you'd have to increase productivity a lot to make this work. Okay, we also discussed the security factor that is affecting fertility rates as well, or is that a separate debate? I mean, you could blend it in. I have a lot to get through because I realize that the second midterm is on Monday of next week, and I've only done like 1.5 units, and I want to make sure there's enough material to test you on. So I'm going to dodge this question physically in front of the class. If you're not here, you didn't see me like jump slightly to the side. It's a separate question, but again, why more secure countries, right? And even, countries that like high standards of living, low crime, economic security, good social safety nets, all have declining fertility. That's the problem, right? And why, say sub-Saharan African countries or countries in Central Asia with really poor security on a lot of measures have really low or a really high fertility. It's probably too easy to find counterexamples. Like the US is a weird one, right? Because you can always say like economic precarity and physical security are relatively low in the US by modern country standards, and maybe that accounts for it. But then you have, Denmark, and it's like one of the most secure countries with the best social safety net, or Norway, right? Where everybody, technically speaking, is a millionaire because the sovereign wealth fund in Norway has like $1 trillion or something. Everybody there should be super secure. You'd expect high fertility, but you actually see the opposite, right? So again, that's my very quick answer to your very complicated question. Moving on. Okay, so children with college-educated mothers. Only about 12% of children whose mothers have a 4-year college degree live with what Kearney calls an unpartnered mother, but you say single mom, right? It's 29%, right? So a little bit less than a third of children with non-college educated mothers live with their unpartnered mother, and 30% live with an unpartnered mother if mom doesn't have a high school degree, right? So, much higher, not quite triple, but getting pretty close to triple the rate in those whose mothers don't have a college education. Okay, and yeah, there are big gaps across ethnicities, right? Most likely, to be living, with unpartnered mothers is basically Black and Hispanic young people in the US, right? In Canada, it would be Black and Indigenous. Asian families have the highest rates of two-parent families regardless of level of education, right? Now, not surprisingly, and this is not something that Kearney explicitly says, but if we look at, Asian, like East Asian and Southeast Asian people in the US, they're also at the top of the kind of income earning bracket, right? Basically it's like Asian and Southeast Asian, and if you ever want to see this, go to elite US colleges. They're now dominated by Asian students to the point where Harvard and Yale and Princeton were purposely denying Asian applicants simply because there were too many of them and they thought it looked bad. They got sued for it and it went to the Supreme Court. And it was like, you're disadvantaging Asian students because we do too well on standardized testing. Matters when you're getting into a school like that equals prestigious jobs later, right? So Asians, young Asian people dominate, higher ed, especially at elite schools, and, increasingly top levels of the Fortune 500 companies, right? Especially in tech. That's followed by, a certain class of white people, and then, Hispanic and then Black, who are down that socioeconomic ladder. Okay, so there has been a sharp rise in unpartnered mother households, right? And what Kearney says is this is largely driven by an increasing share of mothers who have never been married, not an increase in the divorce rate, right? And yeah, not due to an increase in unmarried cohabiting couples, right? It's almost entirely driven by, simply unpartnered mothers in general, right? Just unpartnered mothers, and typically down that socioeconomic ladder. Okay. So same stat as we saw before, reiterated. 63% of children in the US live with married parents, down from 77% in 1980. And more children living with unpartnered mothers. More than 21% of children now in the US live with single moms, right? Unpartnered mothers. There are other living arrangements too, right? About 8% live with unmarried parents, right? So typically cohabiting, and unmarried parents, or a parent and an unmarried partner, right? So, basically two adults in the household, one of which is related to them and one of which isn't. A little less than 5% live with an unpartnered father, so pretty uncommon, and 4.3% do not live with a parent at all. They're likely to live with grandparents or aunts and uncles in that situation. Okay. Now, family stability. When it comes to something like cohabitation or unmarried parents that have a child together, only about a third of them, right? So 1 in 3 or 33% of unmarried parents are still together by the child's 5th birthday, right? So by the age of 5, 2/3 of those parents will be no longer together. And this leads to generally high levels of instability and family complexity, right? Step parents, different partners coming into the home, all of this sort of stuff. And this, generally speaking, will increase a bunch of really negative outcomes, the worst of which is abuse and sexual abuse. Partners who are not one of your parents in the household increase, especially male ones, increase the risks of abuse and sexual abuse in children. Okay, and a third of fathers, so again, 1/3 of fathers had totally disappeared from their children's lives by the child's 5th birthday, right? So, bad, generally. Okay. So, total percent of the population, if we look at, children in the US, a little over half of them are white, 13% of them are black, 6 are Asian, and a little bit less than a quarter of them are Hispanic. Of those living with married parents, or the percentage of each that live with married parents, and you see here the disparity, right? 77% of white children live with married parents. 88% of Asian children live with married parents, right? So that's the highest percentage. And not inconsequentially, they have the best life outcomes. 62% of Hispanic children, and then only barely more than a third of black children live with married parents. Okay. So, again, if we're looking at, never married, right? How many of these parents were married and then got divorced? For 70% of black unpartnered mothers, right? Black single moms were never married. It's a little over half of the Hispanic ones. And then again, white and Asian are the lowest at less than, basically just around a third for each, a little more than a third for white unpartnered mothers and a third for Asian unpartnered mothers. Okay. Now, when it comes to unpartnered mothers with a college degree, they're more likely to be divorced, right? They're more likely to have been married at one point. And this is consistent across, all racial and ethnic groups. So, if you have a college degree, it's more likely that you were married and then you got divorced. Now, typically what this means and why it's positive, previously married parents tend to provide more resources and fathers are more involved in previously married scenarios, right? So previously married dads are going to be more involved with their kids than dads, sorry, going fast through this, than fathers who were never married, right? So more resources, they're more likely to be involved, more likely to stay in their kids' lives, right? Okay, and right, we see in this little chart percentages, right? So our percentage of never married and divorced, basically, if you have a 4-year college degree, you're actually less I'm reading this wrong. I don't know what this chart is. I'm going to skip it. I'd have to interpret it for a second. I'm kind of rushing. Okay, so why is this chart here? I'll figure that out in a sec. It'll come to me. Let's talk child support. All right, so child support doesn't really help that much when it comes to supporting children, largely because, right, the share of unmarried mothers receiving child support is far less than 100%, and assignment of and compliance with child support is typically incomplete. U.S. Census Bureau says only about half of custodial parents had a legal or informal child support arrangement. 70% of them received at least some of what they're owed, right? So of this 50%, 70% received some of what they're owed. Only 44% receive the full payment. And yeah, child support owed, back child support is somewhere around 33.7 billion, and that's just an estimate. That's total child support in the US. Total child support in the US is 33.67 billion. About 60% of that amount was received in 2015, which is an average of about $3,447 per year received by the custodial parent, which is not a lot of money, right? If you, can imagine, I don't know, if you ever played hockey, right? Imagine trying to put your kid in hockey. It maybe costs $2,000 a year to keep your kid in hockey, right? So almost all of your child support is then eaten up by that. Now, what is this chart? Why am I being confused by what it is? Because I haven't read the book and I read it last fall. Okay. Oh, this is of unpartnered mothers, right? what do we have? So those with 4-year college degrees, it used to be, right, if we go back, okay, go away, to 1980, 70% of those with 4-year college degrees, 75, you're hurting me, 75% of women, of unpartnered mothers had been divorced, right? That number is now down to 57%. It was only 10% who were never married in 1980. That's now up to 32%, but still relatively low. For high school and some college, right, back in 1980, 80% of unpartnered mothers were divorced. That's now down to 35%, and the never married number has jumped. And the same story, right, for our no high school degree, right? So basically, in our lower kind of education and therefore earning potential, far more unpartnered mothers are never married. Okay. So it's almost a quarter of US children live with one parent, right? An unpartnered mom or dad. The global average is about 7. Canada's is better than the US, about 15%, whereas Mexico is only about 7%. Okay, so higher education correlates with 2-parent households, right? So in the EU, right, so if we want to get to another example of a pretty developed place, the EU, 79% of children with highly educated mothers, right, that would be a 4-year university degree, live in married parent households, right? So really, really high. What did I mean by when I said reverse trend for cohabit? Oh, yeah. When we look at cohabitation, right, it's generally speaking far less common. You see far less, basically less educated people tend to have children and then cohabit, right? So unpartnered parents tend to be less educated or cohabiting, right? All right, any trends for single motherhood? Well, in the US, the rates have increased from 1980 to 2011, 2015, and then it's stayed pretty flat since then with only minor increases. And we've seen similar patterns happening in other parts of the world. Unpartnered mothers is a growing phenomenon across kind of the developed world. Okay. By the way, I created this image with AI, and I use it because it's so horrific, because it just looks entirely wrong. And I was like, create for me an image of, because Copilot is now built into Microsoft PowerPoint. And I was like, give me an image for this slide of 2 parents who love each other. And it gave me this. And I'm like, but this guy's head is the wrong angle. It's just like, it just looks wrong. I don't know why. I was like, okay. Anyway, parental love. So, why, among the benefits of living with married parents, right? Children observe their parents loving each other, hopefully, and at least hopefully witness their parents working through challenges together, right? This models for them, expectations for love and what they should expect out of adult relationships. And hopefully these are mostly positive relationships. Okay. So, 2-parent families, right? 2-parent families have significant advantages. And again, those advantages are largely time and money. I changed the time on my clock. All right, woohoo. It was actually hard for me, so it's all good. I always draw the clock the same way. Time and money. I usually draw time and money in Intro to Social Research because I talk a lot about how time and money are important. Okay. So, lots of information from the US Census Kearney draws on to support this. Okay, among which single mother families, 5 times more likely to live in poverty than married couple families, and single father families are nearly twice as likely, right? So single mother families considerably more likely to live in poverty than essentially any other social arrangement. Okay, 22.2% of families headed by a woman without a spouse live in poverty. It's about 11.5% of households led by a man, right? So single father families. it's only 4% of married couple families that live in poverty, right? So in this way, a considerably better social arrangement in terms of, poverty is bad. I think we can all agree on that. And one of the strongest predictors of whether you're going to live in poverty is family structure. Okay, poor adults are more likely to become single parents, right? So poverty in this way kind of perpetuates itself. Okay, I know this isn't the last slide, so I'm going to check how many slides I have left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sorry, I was doing the count from Sesame Street. All right, let's talk. We'll try to get through this and then we'll take a break. We'll come back and do one more unit, and I promise it'll be quick and fun. And it has a long video in there, so you can stop listening to me blab. Or as my children put it, yap. My son texted me the other day from his field trip. They went to the town of Legal, where a tour guide talked about the murals in the town of Legal, which I think sounds like a pretty terrible field trip, to be honest. But he's like, all this field trip is yapping. And I'm like, okay, what's the difference between yapping in school and yapping on your field trip? He's like, the field trip yapping is even more boring. I'm like, okay. So yeah, I got a long video on the next section, so I'll yap at you a little less. Okay, children with married moms, right, have better outcomes, right? And this gap is consistent across age, education level of mothers, right? So younger mothers, older mothers, mothers who are more or less educated, it doesn't matter. The children of married moms have better social outcomes, right? Concurrently or concomitantly, there's a consistent trend of disadvantage compared to two-parent households in single-parent households, right? So there's a relative disadvantage for single mother households, and again, across age, race, and education levels. Support from non-resident fathers, relatives, and programs help, right? So social programs can help, but they're typically insufficient to make up for the differences, right? Okay, and what explains this, right? Well, higher income in married parent households explains some of this gap, but not all of this gap, right? And some attempts, right, to increase incomes for single mother families. This is one thing that Kearney thinks is promising, but probably insufficient, because even with income supports, difference in experiences and outcomes remain. And there's been lots of attempts, in the US and globally to give supplemental income to women, and it helps, but there's still gaps in, you can't create more time, right? So, you might give mom more money and that will alleviate the poverty, but different time again. Things like, taking your kid to soccer practice or getting them over for, violin lessons, it's still something that time-constrained parents are going to struggle with, and a single parent just has less time than two parents, right? It's harder to split tasks. Okay, what are the other things that marriage does really well? So, it allows for task specialization amongst parents, right? So, it allows parents to play to their relative strengths, right? What you're good at, you can do and leave things to the other person, right? So if one person has more of an affinity for cooking or caring for children or managing finances, or communicating with school or setting up play dates, right? Whatever it is, right? You can specialize. One parent takes the job that they are more comfortable with. My brother-in-law and his wife, they're funny because they just have task jobs, blue jobs and pink jobs, right? And they're very stereotypical in what is a blue job or a pink job. But it's kind of funny, right? That's an example of task specializations. Like taking out the trash is a blue job. Cleaning up vomit is a pink job, apparently, for some reason. So, and they're funny. You'll listen to them and it's like, their daughter threw up and it's like, yeah, pink job, that's you. And they have sort of divvied out the tasks based on, and fixing things, blue job. So all of this, making pierogies, pink job, it works really well for them. So it increases efficiency in managing household tasks, right? And it means that a person who's not, good at a certain task doesn't have to do that as much. Okay, so yeah, managing finances, daily chores, cooking, laundry, right? Whatever, childcare, right? Whatever it happens to be. Okay. Tends to reduce stress and workload, right? Promotes teamwork and cooperation. And like we said back here, teamwork and cooperation, like these two AI-generated people, is good because it shows good models to children of what their future relationships should look like. Oh, they're not as pronounced, right? So yeah, the US is a particularly nasty case. That said, there's still differences, right? And you still see better outcomes in general. But yeah, the gaps aren't as pronounced in a place like Norway or Denmark. They're still there, but not to the same degree. Okay. I swear I'm almost done. Okay. And here's where those gaps, tend to follow cross-culturally and not dependent necessarily on incomes or social safety nets. Children of divorced parents exhibit way more issues compared to the children of parents who are together, right? And this is like all sorts of things: higher rates of crime, higher rates of other kinds of delinquency, drug use, alcoholism, earlier initiation of sexual activity, which generally is not conducive to adolescent mental health for lots of reasons. What are the other ones? Substance abuse, mental health problems, right? Across educational outcomes, right? Kids with married parents who are together have better educational outcomes, right? They tend to have greater career attainment as well. So outcomes in general are better for children whose parents stay together, which again, I think speaks to Rigneris's point that marriage is kind of a social justice issue because we're splitting into societies of marriage haves and marriage have-nots. Okay, and lots of evidence here. I'll go through it really quick. This study by Gruber, right, looking at census data in the US from 1960, 1970, 1980, and 1990, found increases in divorces led to worse outcomes for children, right? Lower levels of education, lower income, more marital churn for them, and increased rates of poverty. Okay, like I said, I can go through these really quickly because they're just a bunch of pieces of evidence. Feel free to cite any of these in your midterm responses. 2022 study on family structure and education said family structure increasingly important in educational attainment. Living with one or two parents predicts college completion. Living with two parents, higher completion. Living with one parent, lower. Stronger predictive power for those turning 28 between 2006 and 2015. And yeah, subsidizing pre-college investment for single-parent families was more impactful than tuition subsidies. And especially here, they cited pre-K. Pre-K for children of single parents had a long-term effect. So paying for pre-K was really helpful. Okay. This 2009 study on family structure and young adult outcomes took 1997 National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, NLSI. Again, Americans have amazing data that goes back with all of these weird studies. What did it say? Growing up without both biological parents leads to lower educational attainment, a higher incidence of unmarried parenthood, right? So if you live with an unmarried parent, you're likely to become an unmarried parent, so it perpetuates these things. And or incarceration in young adulthood, most pronounced amongst marginalized communities, especially young Black men were particularly affected. And average childhood income, income disparities during childhood. Average childhood income was $35,430 for children of unmarried mothers, compared to more than double that, $82,454 for children of married mothers. And yeah, children of single mothers spent 36.5% of their childhood in poverty versus only 8.6% for children of married mothers, right? So, relatively good. Okay, alternative parenting arrangements. So what do we have here? Okay. Resource sharing and co-parenting for unmarried parents Yeah, so like if you live together, right? So cohabiting, if you cohabit long term, that can help, right? And it's similar to marriage, though not quite as good for reasons that are a little bit unclear. Maybe people keep their finances still more separate. So long-term partnerships and shared commitment can bridge resource gaps, but cohabitation is less stable, especially as you move down the socioeconomic ladder than marriage. And it seems to be here because marriage causes, like getting divorced is a little bit of friction, right? Whereas splitting up, if you're cohabiting, is a little bit easier from a legal perspective. Step families, right? And again, there are great step families, but as a statistical whole, step families tend not to be great for kids. So a lot of times what happens, the focus shifts for the parents from resources, or they shift their resources to the new relationship, right? They're focused on the new relationship. And compared to step families, children fare better with their two biological parents. Again, on average, there are great step parents for sure, but on average, it's not a great arrangement, right? Stepmothers tend to invest less in their stepchildren's health. And this is particularly notable with stepdaughters, right? Stepmothers and stepdaughters have a really fraught relationship, which some people have called like the Cinderella paradox, right? And some people have suggested that, this principle, well, sociologists now understand it statistically, has long been understood kind of culturally, and Cinderella is the example of that, right? The wicked stepmother and stepsisters, use all the family resources for themselves. That's basically what it is. And adolescents with stepfathers show worse behavioral outcomes. And I will say, some of the more like distressing kind of statistics is if you have typically a stepfather, your odds of being abused rise, like either physically or sexually, rise 100 times. Now, that's still better than if you have a rotating cast of partners coming through the house. So if an unmarried parent has different partners coming in, at that point, it's something like 1,000 times, right? The more partners are introduced, the worse your odds get of being, of not being abused. Okay. Same-sex partnerships, really limited resource on same-sex parenting, but at least from the data we have, it looks to be about as good as opposite sex parents, right? There doesn't seem to be any major difference. They tend to fare as well, and even sometimes a little bit better, because same-sex couples tend to be that have children or adopt children tend to be of a higher socioeconomic strata, because it's expensive and difficult. Resource sharing, right? I have that point at the top. I should erase that part. I got the typos, but not the repeated information. All right. Wait, do I have that? Comparative stability of cohabitation versus marriages. Yeah, cohabitation partnerships are less stable than marriages, and that instability leads to resource gaps. Okay, is this my last slide? I think it is. And then we'll take a break, I promise. Yes, last slide. Okay, so negative parental influence. So marriage brings obviously additional resources, but that depends on the mother and father's resources. And what's increasingly true is that even having a father around, if that father has no positive resources, that actually tends to be a detriment. And this is probably why, to some extent, especially as you move down the socioeconomic ladder where men are struggling more, you're seeing more unpartnered mothers, right? Because they're having children with men who are, bring no positive resources, maybe are violent, chaotic, maybe have been incarcerated or whatever, right? And so that actually is a detriment to the children. Okay, now, in the US, this is increasing, right? About 40% of births in the US are to men who do not bring positive resources into the home, right? So about, 4 out of 10 kids in the US are born to dads who have negative resources or don't bring positive resources, at least, right? So they probably don't have a job or aren't stable or whatever it happens to be. Okay. And yeah, approximately 70% of births to non-college educated mothers are fathered by men with no positive resources, right? So again, down that educational and social ladder, this is more present, which again, you see in some of those marriage rates. Okay, and what Kearney says, single parenthood is a significant social problem, despite, single parents often doing heroic work and trying really hard. It's not to villainize single parents. But yeah, and it extends well beyond child rearing. And I think, as we'll talk about when we talk about boys and men, ask the question, why many men are unfit as marriage partners or engaged fathers at all. Okay, between adoption and biological parents, from my understanding of the literature, adoption is slightly worse, but it's negligibly worse in general. But there's like very small differences between it. The big one comes particularly in adoption, in a very specific scenario, is if a child is adopted and then the parents subsequently have biological children, the child who was adopted tends to fare a little bit worse, right? So a relatively rare scenario. Okay, let's take a break. Let's take 15 minutes or 15, is 15 enough? Okay, we'll say 15. So let's come back at, I can't do math. 43, 48. Okay, 48. And we'll jump into another unit. Oh, I should be able to get that one knocked off really quickly. It's a shorty. Okay, I did that one super fast. Okay, I have to pee. Do I have enough tea for? Oh, I can leave my microphone here. I'll need to bring it with me to the bathroom. Me.
That I
Okay, that makes 2:48. So I will get started here. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about sex and relationships for our younger cohorts. Okay, so in this, in here, we'll talk a little bit about, um, you know, is there a sex recession? Right, that's something that increasingly is coming up in the literature. And then we're going to talk about a couple of little topics. So we're going to talk about hookup culture, and we're going to talk about pornography, and end off kind of talking, cheap sex. Okay, so pretty well established in the literature now, and kind of across social science, that sex is down. Right now, it's down across, and I'll show you on these charts in a second. Essentially across all demographics, right? People are having less sex today than in the past. But here, we're going to look a little bit, obviously, at young people, because I think that's, well, obviously it's sociology of youth, so that is what's relevant to us. And I took some graphs because I thought this was interesting a couple years ago from this article in the LA Times. That's supposed to be an arrow. I just failed at it. There we go. All fixed. And a couple of interesting charts here, just looking at kind of the progression over time of a couple of things. All right, so this is 2021, right? So a few years ago now. But and this was from the California Health Interview Survey. And what did it find, right? Well, in the last year, in the prior 12 months, right, about a third of women said they had had 0 sexual partners. Just a hair under 60% of them said they had 1 sexual partner in that period. And, 8.6% of them said that they had 2 or more partners, right? Now, a much larger percentage of men, 18 to 30, reported, so 43%, so 10% more men reported having 0 sexual partners in the last year. And again, a smaller number of men reported having 1 sexual partner in the last year, and a slightly larger number of men, though still a really tiny minority, said that they had 2 partners or more. Okay, so obviously the most common sort of scenario for Californian men and women 18 to 30 was having 1 sexual partner, though again, for men, it was less than half had 1 sexual partner in the last year. And then, for men, it was much more common to have 0 sexual partners than it was to have 2 or more, right? So a really small number of both men and women having multiple partners in a year. And this, you can see the change over time, right? It used to be, back in those heady days of 2011 to 2013, that it was about 20% of men, sorry, this is all young people. Sorry, this is not just men. Of all young people had 2 or more sexual partners. That number obviously drops by the time you get to 2021. And 0 partners gets considerably bigger. And I pulled this quote out of the piece because I thought it was kind of interesting. And I don't know why I found it interesting. I just did. Because I think it speaks to, oops, that hasn't happened in a bit. Up we go. Okay. Some of the attitudes and differences that we might be seeing in Gen Z who are thinking of this, right? Rhodes, 28-year-old working as a certified nursing assistant in LA, basically said, I'm glad people have fun with it and it works for them, but they think sex is kind of gross, it seems messy, and it's vulnerable in a way they think would make them seem uncomfortable, right? And again, not that this is representative, but I thought it was interesting. Okay, so these charts. So these are from a social scientist at Washington University named Ryan Burge. I'm a big fan of his. If you've taken Social Religion with me, you're sick of the name Ryan Burge. If you haven't, you take Social Religion with me and I'll make you sick of the name Ryan Burge. Really good at taking kind of big data sets and pulling interesting information out of them. And what he did was take information from the General Social Survey, right? This is this big survey that's been running in the US since the 1970s, but here he broke out data from 1989 to 2002, bless you, on 2 different graphs, right? And what do we see here is basically at the bottom we have age, right? And at, on this graph, or in this axis, is the percentage having sex over the once a month over the last year. And what we see, obviously, what we would expect, married people, because they have a partner, on the whole, tend to have more sex. But in the period 1989 to 1993, if we compare it to 2016 to 2022, people were having, more sex, and even, married 20-year-olds, which is interesting, or married young people in here, right? Maybe I'll make this slightly bigger. Haha, right? So our married people, even, in the youngest part of the cohort, were having less sex by, 2016 to 2022, at least, over once a month over the last year than they had been in 1989 to 1993, right? Where it was basically 100% of, married people from 20 to 30, right? After which it goes down as you get older. Obviously, some drives go down. Now, the same story is kind of true for our not married people, although obviously what you see is not married people often because they lack a partner, right? Even at that youngest age, we're having less sex than their married peers, right? But still, that blue line in our youngest part of the age bracket, the one we're really interested in, was, had declined basically from that period 1989 to 1993 compared to 2016 to 2022. So the closer we get to the present, the less sex people were having, right? And then this number was like, can you see my hand? Yes, you see my hand there, right? That number there is it's off the graph, it's off the kind of trend line, but it's really, really low, right? Our like 18, 19-year-olds, right, in this kind of reporting in our 2016 to 2022, they were down below 30%, having had sex at least once a month over the last year, compared to, right, that point right there. Ooh, fun pointing with the pen. That's our older cohort, right, 1989 to 1993, right? So sex generally is down. It does change when you get to like that crossover point at around 40, where, I guess more contemporary 40-year-olds were having sex more than they were back in 1989, 1993. I don't have any explanation, but this is a course on youth, so I don't need one. Okay. Now, if we look at our general trend lines, though, over, when we combine married and unmarried, we see there's a pretty consistent gap, right? So if we look, which I can't write when I'm zoomed in like this, which stinks. But when we look, right, we see that red line is consistently below that blue line, which means, people are having considerably less sex than they were in the past. And that gap is pretty consistent. It doesn't get a whole lot bigger as we move through the age distribution until you get to the, quite, above 60, or I guess where does it start to spread out? Like 50, 55, right? And again, we don't care about that because this is a sociology of youth class. We kind of see across the board, people are having less sex in general. All right, zoomity zoom. It did zoomity zoom rather well. Okay, so in his piece that he wrote about this, what's the analysis that that Burge kind of comes up with? And I really like this. I just screenshotted it right out of the piece. And he says, right, I guess we're pondering the same thing now. Why are folks having sex less today than they were in the 90s? And he says, it doesn't take too much imagination to figure that out. He thinks it's smartphones, right? I think we can all admit that sexual behavior is somewhat related to boredom. When you have something to entertain yourself, then sex may not be top of mind. Now, I do think there's more to it than that. And we get to Rigneris's argument when he's talking about cheap sex. I do think there's a role to be played here for especially something like pornography, but I do think he's basically right. And I like this quote, because obviously I love Neil Postman, and I'm always a fan when people cite him, right? And he said he's reminded of Neil Postman's masterpiece, Amusing Ourselves to Death. Postman's thesis is simple. Huxley's Brave New World was right. Our addiction to amusement, right, so smartphones are fun, is what will lead to the decline of civilization. For some, farming clicks and shares on social media gives us a dopamine hit that supplants feelings derived from sexual contact. And he says, I have to admit, that is a really bleak thought, which I agree with. Okay, let's clear these off. Okay. All right, let's talk hookup culture a bit. And like I promised, I'm going to yap a little less. I'm going to let Donna Freitas do some yapping here.
That I collected from students. So, young adults believe they are supposed to be casual about sex in college. And so 45% of the students that answer this question about what do you think your peers think about sex at college, and 36% of the students at non-religious, private, and public institutions said, my peers are too casual about sex. So they made a differentiation between everybody else and themselves. Everybody is casual about sex, but I'm not. And then just about the rest of the students said, everybody on my campus is casual about sex. So they didn't make a judgment, they just said to be at college is to be casual about sex, though many of them don't feel that way themselves. Now I'm going to tell you, so the official social contract of the hookup, it really is, it's a social contract. So one, it's anything from kissing to sex, and I mean that, anything from kissing to sex. It's a broad spectrum of sexual activity. We often assume it's casual sex or it's sexual intercourse, but it doesn't have to be. It might be, but it might not. It could be making out in the corner for 5 minutes, and the reason why is because students like a broad umbrella for what a hookup is because there's so much pressure to claim that you're a part of it. And so often hookups are a lot more innocent than they might sound because so many students, especially young men, feel like they need to be able to claim high numbers. The other thing that defines a hookup is that it's brief. Some people just assume one night stand, but it might literally just mean like 5 minutes in the bathroom. I know, very romantic, bathroom kissing. So, but definitely brief. And then the third one is the one that really trips students up. So you're not supposed to feel any emotion. You are not supposed to get attached. And so communication equals bad. So you're not supposed to communicate because if you communicate, you might actually start to care. Then the fourth unofficial one I'll add is alcohol. So many students that I talk to will say things like, without alcohol, nobody would ever get together. Without alcohol, nobody would ever kiss. So, what do college students say about their hookups? So the students who talked about their hookups from my study broke up in the following way. 41% of them talked about their hookups as making them profoundly unhappy. So they used words like, hookups make me feel unhappy, abused, sad, disgusted, duped. So a lot of sadness. And then there's these 23% who are ambivalent, and 36% who are more or less fine. And I put them almost together because there's really a fine line between the students who say they're ambivalent and the students who are just fine. And so the students who are ambivalent use the word whatever all the time, which is why I like to call them the whateverists. So they would say things like, hooking up is whatever, it's whatever, it's whatever. And so therefore they're the whateverists. And then you have this other group, they're the happiest bunch in the hookup crowd, I think, and they say that their hookups are fine. And that's it, they're fine. Not fantastic, not fabulous, but fine. And I think we often assume that a hookup is going to be this very exciting, wonderful, freeing experience of sexual intimacy where you're at a party and you see someone you think is hot and you tell your friends, look at the hot person, and then you go and you conquer the hot person and you're like, wow. And it's more like the way the students describe, you're drunk, you're at a party, you're sitting on the couch, it's 3 a.m, you're looking around, you don't know where your roommates went, you're tired, you don't know how you're getting home. You look next to you, there's this person, they look at you, you're like, all right. And so those are the fine, ambivalent sorts of hookups, not so exciting. Which brings me to, hookups are efficient. Now let me explain that. That's not my language, that's the student's language. I remember the first time I heard that, I started hearing it a couple of years ago when a student told me, well, hookups are efficient. I remember thinking, efficient? You mean like a vacuum cleaner? So, and so I think, so that the students are getting, that group, that whatever's group in the middle, they're getting bigger. Students are getting more ambivalent about sex. They're getting better at the hookup contract, right? Because to not care is to be ambivalent, to be whatever about it. So hookups are efficient. And when you ask students what they mean by that, they will say, well, we're really busy. We're also overscheduled. We have such long to-do lists. We have so much to get done. Everything is go, go, go. We're always on, and everyone expects that of us. We have no time for relationships in college. We have been told by the forces that are. But we gotta get our sex done, kind of like you gotta get the dishes done. That's how they talk about it. And so hookups are efficient. So it's efficient sexual intimacy. So students on college campuses today, if you talk to them, they will often tell you that they believe hookups are their only option. And there's a lot of suffering in hookup culture. There's a lot of sadness. There's a lot of alienation. And the ambivalence that I see growing on college campuses around sex, I think, is a form of suffering. So I want to mention romance and dating, because in the middle of all this hookup culture and this hooking up and talking about how sad they are, how ambivalent they are, or how efficient hookups are, if you ask students today about dating, they get all excited. And so I asked every single student for my study, so what's dating like here? You know, do people date in college? And I got the same answer over and over again, which was something like the following. Nobody ever dates here. People don't date any college anymore, and we're not allowed to date. But then they would finish, but I wish they would. I would totally go on a date if someone asked me, or like I would ask somebody out if it wouldn't be weird. And so I heard this so often, over and over again, this, you know, there is no dating, but I wish there would be, that I got to the point where at the end of my interviews, I wanted to tell the students, listen, I know you think that nobody ever dates here. However, when you leave this room, someone is going to be waiting to come talk to me. If you think they're cute, you should totally ask them out, because believe me, they want to date you. If they're not your type, just come back. I'm here all week. So lots and lots of interest in dating, but lots of unfulfilled dating going on. So students want to date, they feel like they're not allowed to. And the other thing, and this is both men and women, by the way, everyone assumes women want to date, men don't, but both men and women want to date, and men will tell you this behind closed doors. The other thing they yearn for is romance, so much yearning for romance. And what I learned from students was, ironically, in the middle of hookup culture, romance is very chaste. Romance is talking. It's just talking. It is talking for hours, like 5 hours. So, and not just anywhere, not like in the hall of your residence hall. So it's talking for 5 hours in a really lovely place. Like ideally there's a picnic blanket, ideally there's stars, or perhaps 100 candles lit in the room. As a former res life person, I remember thinking, but you're not in your residence hall room because you might burn the hall down. And so lots and lots of yearning for romance. And if you remember, I said that one of the things that defines a hookup is no communication, right? No connection. Well, romance to students is connection. It is knowing and being known. It's having a lavish amount of time to do that. It is just talking. Now, here comes the quiz that I collected.
Otherwise, the internet gets no sound. Is the internet? Yes, the internet is getting sound. Perfect. Okay, so very quickly, just to recap, and so you have it on notes, right? So Donna Freitas, right? She has 2 books on this. One is called Sex and the Soul. One is called The End of Sex. This comes out of The End of Sex, which is, I think, 2013, I think. Okay, so from this, she derived, from doing interviews at different college types, she derived what she said was the official social contract of the hookup, right? And again, anything from kissing to sex, right? And largely, you know, what she says in the book is that this broad definition largely favors men, right, who benefit socially from a higher, shall we say, body count, right? So if you can say you hooked up with some girl at a party, even if you just made out with her for a couple minutes, right, that raises your social status. So it's ambiguous, and it's purposely ambiguous because, you know, to hook up could mean having sex. It doesn't have to, right? It's brief and it's efficient, right? Again, it's meant to fit into busy lives. And think of it this way, right? And if you want to think of a connection to some of the other stuff we just talked about, and we talked about in earlier units, and we talked about with families, right? Relationships are for later, right? So marriage is for much later, right? You've got this capstone model of marriage. So that serious relationship is for later. This time of life, right, when people are young, is for, you know, getting education, getting experiences, not tying yourself down to something relatively inefficient and time consuming, right? Because that's going to come later for you, right? So along with that, right, you're not supposed to get attached. And yeah, alcohol is used as a sort of social lubricant because making out with strangers is not always the thing that someone just wants to do. So to reduce inhibitions, alcohol helps. And yeah, I mean, kind of a good spread, right? 41% don't like it, but feel like they have no choice. 23% are like, it's fine, or whatever. They're whatever. And 36% are more or less fine, But as she says, nobody was like, this is great, I love hookup culture, right? A very small percentage would probably think that. Okay, so what's happened, right? Largely what seems to have happened is a shift in culture. And what I would suggest is a loss of social scripts, right? There used to be these really, and again, if we look back, and we talked about this earlier in the course with the silence, right? And the baby boomers, and then Gen X, it gets a little bit muddier. Millennials, it gets muddier again. There used to be really clear progressions of relationships, right? Where people knew what the phases were, and everybody was sort of expected to follow those scripts. That largely, so that would be what you call dating culture. Dating culture seems to have largely broken down sometime with Gen X and the millennials, and Gen Z, now is left in this sort of, this lurch, right? So most people that she talked to still want relationships, but the culture, right, and these cultural scripts have prioritized against it. Because again, it's like relationships are for later. Being young, right, is a time of exploration of the self, of travel, of education, and all of those things. And relationships simply don't fit into that script very well. Now that said, so dating culture has sort of gotten a little bit more difficult. And it's funny because some other people have talked about this too. University of Boston's Carrie Cronin did a whole documentary on this. Oh, I have it at home. It's on my shelf. What is it called? Oh, The Dating Project or something like that, where basically she challenged, young people to sort of revive dating culture. And one of the things that, it was an assignment in a course that she taught was for the single students was like, ask someone out on a date to kind of bring back, the act of asking someone out. Okay, so because dating and asking someone out is, increasingly seen as, difficult or unappealing, or people have lost the sort of cultural knowledge of how to do it, there's a few, things that have sort of developed according to Freitas, right? Hookups, become hopeful paths to relationships, right? So maybe if you hook up with someone that you like, they might go out with you. And there's a sort of, I will say, slightly torturous path to that, right? Where you would hook up with someone, if it goes well and you like them, maybe you hook up with them multiple times, right? But always avoiding emotions. The famous friends with benefits. I don't know if that's still a phrase. Maybe, you catch feelings, and hopefully both people do, because if it's just one, it will typically end in the relationship ending, right? Because you violated that no communication or no emotional entanglements sort of clause of that social contract. And maybe if you get through all of those stages, you might date, right? And so, when that doesn't happen, ghosting and other things will happen as well. Okay. So, what Freitas suggests in The End of Sex, just her 2013 book, is that one of the big problems facing young people is that they don't know how to date or are afraid of dating. And again, I know the algorithms are such a thing, and apparently YouTube knows me well, because it'll throw these things out there for me occasionally, where there's these videos of people talking about how, yeah, it's really hard to ask people out. And there does seem to be, a social phenomenon here where increasingly, men are afraid of asking women out for fear of either rejection or, being mocked on social media or being seen as predatory, right? So what happens? They don't ask people out. They hook up, even though a large percentage of them seem to not like it. Now, this is super non-scientific. This infographic I do find kind of interesting, though, because it was a poll done, at Duke University in spring of 2014. So again, this is not necessarily like a nationally representative sample or anything, but the infographic is pretty, so I thought I would use it anyway. And here, right, so what do we have? 67% of students never engage in sexual acts outside of a committed relationship, right? So most people still prefer to, have sexual intercourse with someone they're in a relationship with. 76% of the students in this 622 student poll, right, want to be in a committed relationship. Only 39% of them were. 75% of them hook up one or fewer times per month. It's a weird statistic because it's like, okay, 0 is fewer, right? So how many of those are 0 and how many of those are 1? That makes it really muddy. But this is the one that I found really interesting here. Would feel comfortable asking someone out. It was 25% of women. Oops. And 42% of men, right? So minorities of both felt comfortable asking someone out. Now, again, this is way back like over a decade ago. And my understanding is this has gotten worse, not better. Okay. And again, as Donna Freitas said, at all 4 of the college types that she looked at, right? So she looked at evangelical colleges, Catholic colleges, non-religious public and non-religious private colleges. Students reported, that their idea of romance mostly involved talking and getting to know someone. And the word that she used was chaste, right? Spelled like this, from which we get words like chastity, right? Right. So it's non-sexual, right? Is what it means, right? It's chaste. And yeah, it involves, really traditional romantic ideas, talking, long walks, coffee shops, picnics. Virtually none of them said it involved, especially on, say, like a first date, that it involved sex. Some said it might involve kissing if that was like a good night kiss, if the date went really well, but not like furiously making out. And drugs and alcohol were not included outside of maybe a glass of wine with dinner. Okay. So, what does all this look like, right? And again, this is information from the Center for Disease Control's National Youth Behavior Survey, and this data only goes to 2015. And I don't have more updated data on this, but you can kind of see the trends here, right? So this is for, when we're talking 13 to 19-year-olds. And what we see, generally speaking, from 1991 to 2015, what do we see? Well, the percentage of, ever had sexual intercourse has been declining for quite a while, right? It was almost half of young people in 1991. It had dropped to 41% by 2015. Again, so the nice thing about this information is we don't have a pandemic effect here because this is all pre-pandemic, right? Had sexual intercourse before age of 13, yuck. Sorry, I don't like that number. It was 10% back in 1991. It had dropped, by 2015 to 3.9%. No one should feel bad about this or concerned about it. Had sexual intercourse with 4 or more persons during their lifetime, right? That number was almost 20%, so almost 1 in 5 American teenagers reported having sex with 4 or more persons in their lifetime in 1991. Man, the 90s, man. Actually, that could be the 80s, I guess. 11% by 2015, right? So a pretty significant decrease. We're currently sexually active, right? That had dropped 7% over that period. So not a huge drop, but still a drop, right? So less teenagers were currently sexually active. And then condom use, was low in at the end of 1990 or beginning of 1990s, end of the 80s, rose steadily, until about, 2003, 2005, at which point it started to drop again. And it kind of ends up back where it started, but it still kind of peaks and then drops down, largely probably driven by norms that come out of internet pornography. Okay, what do I have on the side here? Yeah, millennials and Gen Z having less sex than older generational cohorts did at the same age, especially true of Gen Z. So, right, any notion that they're like, the internet has made it way easier to have sex and dating apps are driving people to have more sex, total bullshit. Spam. Oh dear. Okay. Not answering you. Usually I do answer and I just leave it on silent but not in class. Okay, rates of marriage have declined precipitously. We know this. Rates of cohabitation have stayed roughly steady, right? So there's a lot more people who are just unpartnered and not with anyone. Less marriages, same amount of cohabitation. So people are in fewer relationships than before. Okay, this is from Twingy's generation, right? So interesting little charts. She says, despite being the Tinder generation, more millennials than ever have had no sexual partner since age 16. And this quote, right, my celibacy is caused by a multitude of things ranging from impossible beauty standards put in place by men and systemic misogyny put in place by men and internalized by other women because of men. I'm mad at men who made it so difficult for me to find love, to find a man who will treat me like a human being and not a sex doll. Okay, so this is percentage of US adults with no sexual partner since age 18, right? And we see, relatively kind of big jumps, especially in this youngest part of the cohort, 20 to 24, right? Back in 1965, it was obviously low because of standards. By the 1990s, right, when millennials are in the sample, it's still relatively low at 14%. Percent of U.S. 26 to 40-year-olds have no sex in the last year by gender. This is from the General Social Survey, and you see this percentage is going up. Oh, sorry, no sexual partners. Yeah, so that is going up, right? And it jumps, especially, when we get here, which is interesting. Again, okay. So here, right, we're talking about Gen X, and very few of them had no sexual partners in the last year. And then once we get into our, where our millennials are in the range, and then, as we get into Gen Z here, we're seeing increases in people having no sexual partners. Okay. I'm blasting through this. I was worried I wouldn't get through it all. I might be done early. You will all cry. Big tears, I'm sure. All right, so we're going to talk about pornography a little bit. And we're going to end off this unit talking about kind of a constellation of technologies and social influences. But pornography, I think, plays an especially interesting role. One, because it's really, really ubiquitous, right? So these are just some weird infographics, right? 30% of all web traffic is porn. 40 million Americans are regular visitors to porn sites. 2/3 of men admit to watching porn versus only about 1/3 of women. 70% of those men, so the bulk of them, are between 18 and 24. And 85% of people who watch porn watch between the hours of 7 p.m. and 3 a.m., right? Okay, so kind of late at night. Oh, maybe I'll say one other thing. Do I have this on this infographic? Oh, no. Okay. Yeah. So 90% of children 8 to 16 have viewed porn, right? And the average age at which a young person now is first being exposed to porn is typically between 8 and 9 years old, right? Yeah, that's the face I made too when I heard that the first time. 8 and 9 years old, right, is the most typical age, and it's usually on, at school or amongst peers. School bus is a popular one, and it's usually driven increasingly by slightly older peers who have a internet-connected smartphone, right? So again, smartphones are to blame for basically everything. And that age is going down more and more. The largest consumers of pornography are 12 to 17-year-old boys. No surprise there. 17% or 70% of men 18 to 34 visit a porn site typically in a typical month, right? Now, I don't like the addiction language around porn, but whatever. 1 in 6 women admit to struggling with porn, and about 25% of search engine requests are for porn. Okay, now that said, one of the things with porn research, and I say this as someone, I haven't done porn research personally, but when I was doing my master's degree, my master's supervisor was one of the leading porn researchers in Canada. So I have I have a good kind of basis in this. Her name is Rebecca Sullivan at University of Calgary. Really fabulous person. And her research on porn is really, really interesting. And I got to like edit manuscripts and create bibliographies. Let me tell you, those were some interesting bibliographies to create. I remember one time, like, because I was using like the library database, and there was this one book. It was called Porn Stars at Home, that I was trying to find to put in the bibliography, and I couldn't find it. And I made the mistake of putting it into Google. I'm like, fuck it, I'll put this into Google. And the results are about what you'd expect. And I was like, oh, this is gonna look bad in my search history. Okay. So I had to explain that one to my wife. I was like, okay, if you see something weird in my search history, this is my job, okay? This is how we're paying our bills this month. So no worries. Okay, now porn research. Porn research has a bunch of problems with it, right? So there's a couple of things, right? And you can kind of generally split porn research into two camps. One, would be typically anti-porn, and one is sex positive. Now there is an increasing body too of just like straight up quantitative, like porn research. I'll talk a little bit about that because like Herbernick, which I cite, Debbie Herbernick does some really interesting work on it, and it's very quantitative and I think fairly unbiased. But it's largely historically been split between like anti-porn and kind of pro-porn feminist scholars or sex-positive feminist scholars. Now that said, they always cite a whole bunch of studies. Now these studies are really, really difficult, right? One of the things is when it comes to like survey research, right? Social desirability bias really skews porn research because even on anonymous web surveys, people lie about their porn use in pretty obviously, right? Because people are embarrassed. They continue to be embarrassed by porn use. It's really, really hard to get an honest picture of what pornography consumption looks like. It's almost impossible to create randomized control studies. My pen has died again. Randomized control studies they're nearly impossible to assemble. And there's very famous studies that people attempted to do where they're like, we're going to do a randomized control study, right? Because we want to see the effects of porn on the brain or on views of women or something like that. But in randomized control studies, you actually need a control group, right? So someone who hasn't used porn. Inevitably, they would try to gather a large enough control group of men in particular that hadn't used porn, and it was basically impossible. And there's a couple of famous examples where basically these people had research grants to do this, and at a certain point, they just gave up on the randomized control study because they're like, we cannot assemble a large enough control group because all of the men that we've been able to recruit, basically they all watch porn, right? So really, really hard. And lab studies. There's been lots of lab studies. These have got to be the weirdest lab studies to run, where they're like, okay, we're gonna look at the brains of porn users and non-porn users. Those are probably not that hard. But there's been other ones where they're like, we're gonna make people watch porn where we do a CT scan of their brain. And I'm like, it's got to be the weirdest experiment to set up and be part of. I'm not gonna lie. Whatever it happens to be. So there's all sorts of problems with porn research, and I actually think a lot of the research isn't very good, and especially when it's ideologically tinged, it tends to be a real problem. And trust me, I've actually read way too much of this. That said, in the, I think, kind of more objective studies, there's two really big categories of concern, right? The first one is body image, and contrary to what you might think, a lot of the body image concerns actually apply to both women and to men in different ways, but body image still a concern. And then relationships, and here, I'm being a little coy with the word relationships. Sexual norms in relationships are a big concern here as well. Okay, no one wants to ask questions about porn. There we go. Okay, I'm kidding. I'm going really fast, and it's probably really hard to absorb what I'm saying. Okay, so a couple of things with body image, right? This is about what you'd expect, right? And this from Naomi Wolf in a piece she wrote for New York Magazine. What she says, right? Talk slower. What young women on campus tell her, right? They can't compete with porn. They know it because, they're real human beings, and they can't compete with photoshopped women, and women, who have actual desires in their lives, right? Things that they actually want and aren't just down to, yell more, you big stud. Um, that the kind of typical dialogue you'd find in those finely crafted porn videos, right? With all of that great acting, right? The norms that porn sets up in terms of body image and behavior are unrealistic. And women do know that they have a hard time because, real relationships, real sex demands things, and porn doesn't, right? You just hit exit, you close your browser when you've watched the porn, and that person is gone. Whereas a real person, might want breakfast or something, or at least an Uber home, or a kind word, who knows, right? Okay, so this one, and largely I pull on it because it quotes Debbie Herbernick, who's a sex researcher. This is really good quantitative work. And, this is a really interesting Atlantic piece on it, right, about the sex recession. So what do we have? A major Dutch study found that among men, frequency of pornography viewing is associated with concerns about penis size, right? And we heard a lot from men, that they were worried. They were too hairy, not fit enough, not big enough, all of that jazz, right? So applies to men and women both. And I think there is a not inconsequential rise in sort of male body image issues, the growth of kind of gym bro culture, right? Men really, focused on physical appearance, and the advent of pornography as well. Okay. All right, now this from a much more, so those are kind of anecdotals and they're journalistic. This is from a meta-analysis done by Owens et al. In the review. Sorry, I can't remember what journal this is actually. The article was called "The Impact of Internet Pornography on Adolescents: A Review of Research," and I pulled out a couple of interesting quotes here. I'll just highlight some interesting bits, right? So, participants discussed messages they inferred from sexually explicit material as it relates to female body image. One participant described the theme, pardon me. Well, what did she say? Oh, I have an eraser. That will not do at all. Well, the girl should be small, thin, and, inferior, while the guy should be big, muscular, and superior, right? So that's the norm that they imply from it. All right. And what else? The study revealed a number of other pertinent results, that there was something called a pornographic script for body type and sexual performance that was reinforced. So the more sexually explicit content you consumed, the more you believe this, right? Okay, so this script created unrealistic and concerning expectations for both males and females who participated in the study. Men expressed insecurities about their ability to perform sexually, and women expressed body image insecurities, right? So what did the males in the study say, right? They were concerned about their ability to perform as well and for the same duration, right? Because porn obviously, shows sex that has longer durations than is typical for men in particular, right? Largely because it's not realistic. It's filmed in shots, right? Men take, I don't want to say performance enhancing drugs, but they will often take things like Viagra in order to maintain, an erection and all of that. And then, they'll go off, film part of the scene, come back later, film the rest of it, right? So porn gives unrealistic expectations and people internalize that. And what did the women think? They saw sexually, an ideal body type. Let's just say that. One woman said she felt very unattractive. You can't say you're not influenced by this, and you want to have these ideal bodies, right? And again, obviously, for the most part, porn actresses tend to be, very attractive, often photoshopped, right, in ways that make it hard for normal, average people to actually compete with that, right? Okay. So, relationships. And here, sexual behaviors and sexual norms. So this from Herbernick et al., right? It's from this really interesting 2019 study that Debbie Herbernick and her cohorts did. And here, I think there's a couple of really interesting things to pull out of the research on porn. One of them is, right, more women than men reported someone had done something during sex that made them feel scared, right? Specifically, it's 12.3% of women and 3.8% of adolescent men indicated that this had happened to them, right? So something happened during sex that made them feel scared. And then when you get a little bit older, it's almost a quarter of adult women and 10% of adult men, right, who say that. Okay, now what are these things? They're most typically, one of these terms that I really think, is kind of industry spin from the porn industry, choking, right? And other aggressive behaviors like hitting, forceful hair pulling were described amongst those scary sexual experiences, right? Now here's, you wanna know a terrible stat. This is a terrible stat. So choking, is a porn term that's used, but medically choking is when you eat like a big chunk of an apple and you can't swallow it and you have to cough because you can't breathe. What happens during, porn and what's increasingly being modeled for people as the sexual norm is actually strangulation, right? It's someone is strangling you. The number 2 cause of strokes in women under 40, that's a very specific stat apparently, in the UK is strangulation, right? The number 1 cause is preeclampsia, right? So it's actually a pregnancy-related complication where your blood pressure gets really, really high during pregnancy. The second leading cause of strokes, right? Women under 40 shouldn't have strokes. It's something that happens to older people. The number 2 cause of strokes in women under 40 is strangulation, right? Because if you do it wrong, and it's incredibly easy to do wrong, you can cut off blood supply, blood clots, and you get a stroke going off into the brain, or a clot going off into the brain. There you get a stroke, right? So number 2 cause of strokes in women under 40 in the UK is strangulation, usually during sex. Okay, other things. Probably never thought you'd hear these things in a class, did you? Things like anal sex and choking, strangulation, appear to have become more commonly portrayed in sexually explicit material, and sexual choking behaviors, interest in choking, are associated with porn use, right? So the more porn you consume, the more likely you are to think these things are interesting, right? So now this one I will highlight because, again, scary. Most of the choking instances described in their qualitative interviews appear to have not been discussed with the partner. The other person just started strangling the respondent. So consequently, some worried they were being strangled. I mean, they are. Right? A common form of intimate partner violence, especially committed against women by men. Okay. So how does this affect relationships, and why might it be related to, say, a sexual kind of recession? Well, this, again, from the Atlantic, studies show that in the absence of high-quality sex education, boys look to porn for help understanding sex. Anal sex and other acts women can find painful are ubiquitous in mainstream porn. Now, I actually think this is BS, right? I think porn now is so prevalent that whether you have good sex ed or not, and whether you focus on consent or not, which sex ed programs should, porn is a pretty ubiquitous social force, right? It's being consumed especially heavily by sexually emergent boys, and this is going to cause problems, right? Because they're going to get their sexual norms from pornography. Your 20-minute or 2-hour talk in your high school classroom about consent isn't going to mitigate hours of porn watching. So porn is affecting behavior. Okay, so yeah, modeling your behavior after what you've seen on screen can lead to what's known as spectatoring, right? That is worrying about how you look and sound when you're having sex, right? So it's bad for you in general. There's been lots of research on, men and sexual function. The more you consume porn, the more likely you are to be worried about your body, about things like premature ejaculation and all of that stuff. It actually makes you worse at it in a lot of ways. Trying to model, sex on porn often makes it bad. And then, violent porn, of which there is a fair bit. And this is from Abigail Schreier's 2020 book. I can't remember what Abigail Schreier's 2020 book was called. something consequences. I can't remember. Anyway, it's not important. Violent porn not only terrifies young girls and about men and the prospect of sex with them, it's also changing the expectations and behaviors of boys. And I think this is pretty uncontested, right? A lot of women now, especially if they've also watched mainstream porn, are worried about boys. And it's made men kind of gross, right? When it comes to sexual expectations. Okay, last slide? Yes, last slide. Okay, I can do this. So, I got 10 minutes to do one slide. 14 minutes later. Okay, so we talked about Mark Rigneris, and we've talked a little bit about cheap sex in the previous unit, right? Because everybody repeats the same ideas over and over, but that's how it goes. Okay, so Rigneris, what has he theorized? Well, basically what he's theorized is that one of the major factors that's inhibiting the formation of long-term relationships and marriages is among younger people is what he calls cheap sex. And he thinks, cheap sex is basically what he says, the triangulation, right? So it's the effect of three intersecting kind of technologies and social forces that are all changing norms around sex. So this is artificial contraception, online dating, and internet porn, right? Okay. And he based his book, Cheap Sex, off a big study of a research project called the Relationships in America study, which polled 15,738 Americans 18 to 60. Okay, so what are these three technologies and what do each of them do? So, well, basically, as we talked about before, right, especially for men, sex is now, in a sense, more accessible to men with less cost. Now, I know at the beginning I showed you that a lot less men are having sex, right? The percentage of men who have had zero partners in the last year has gone up. But porn is part of this equation as well. So what does Rigneris say, right? Well, basically, what do we have? Contraception. Really simply, and you all understand this already, is that contraception separates sex from reproduction, right? So sex and babies gets split up, which means it's made it so that women are more able and more willing to have sex with men without commitment, right? So that makes it, that's been true since the 1960s. And we talked about that. We talked about the boomers and then Gen X and then millennials, right? So that one we understand, right? It lowers the cost of sex because it's less likely that someone's going to get pregnant and therefore the risks are lower, right? So women don't have to demand as much from men before, having sex, right? And I say, if you like it, you don't actually need to put a ring on it, right? Because sex is easier to get. Okay, online dating. So online dating, watching the clock. What it does is it expands the number of available sexual partners, right? So, how to put this? Well, it's pretty easy, right? Typically speaking, if you were like in a normal social setting in 1993, right, before online dating, your pool of, possible partners, right, was probably somewhere between 100 and 200 people, right? So that includes people acquaintances, friends of friends, your that niece of that person at the grocery store that they want to set you up with, whatever it happens to be, right? A relatively small pool. Online dating, right, really expands that number exponentially, right? You could go on Tinder right now. I can't, but you could. I once asked my wife, because this is a joke, would you mind if I created a Tinder profile as, just for research? And, she replied, would you mind if I research divorce lawyers just for, just for research? I'm like, okay, I understand where this has gone. So I thought it was a pretty good reply. So I never did create that Tinder profile for research, right? Whatever. It expands the number of partners, right? Potentially tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Now I know people match at really low rates, but it increases at least the pool of people you think might be out there by quite a bit. It also, and some of the more recent research on this has suggested it breaks, the relationship market in really odd ways because these platforms strongly favor like the most attractive people, especially the most attractive men, right? It's something like, it's like women find 80% of men basically unattractive. Like when you show them like pictures of men, they'll find like 80% of men pretty unattractive. Now, this used to be compensated for by, you'd be around people and you might have found that person annoying at first. By her account, my wife found me tremendously annoying the first time she met me. And I grew on her over time like a fungus, I guess. But, being around someone and getting to know them a little bit eventually sort of like breaks down some of those initial impression barriers. And online dating really favors against this, right? It's all about single first impressions, after which, it's swipe whatever direction left, I think. And then that person is gone forever, right? So it increases the pool of available people. So you think there's always a lot of people out there, even though it does actually make relationship formation a little bit more difficult. The other thing, and I want to mention this because I found this really interesting. This is from Louise Perry and her book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Really interesting book. One of the things that online dating also does is it decouples dating from, and especially being set up with someone, from social kind of weight, right? Where it used to be like, if someone set you up on a date, and I'm going to say this, mostly for men, if they got set up on a date with someone, right, one of their friends or a cousin set you up with one of their girlfriends or someone they knew, and you acted like a total jerk, right, or you were gross, you would hear about it, right? Because that person would go back and be like, why did you set me up with that guy? They're super gross. And then you knew that you would never get another date with that person, or that you would never get another date out of the person who set you up because you'd acted in a way that was socially inappropriate. And that's all broken, right? Like people can act as gross and say as weird of things to you on dating apps as they want. And really, like you'll block them, but that's the most social effect they're going to get. It doesn't reverberate in the rest of their life. They don't get a reputation for being gross and weird, which they would have in the past. Okay, so that's dating, and that makes things harder too. Men being weird always makes things harder. And then porn, right? So porn, he says, is the cheapest sex of all, right? And we talked about this before. It is so cheap and available that basically, it's free. And a lot of men seem to be turning to porn because it's just easier than getting your shit together and making yourself, you laughed at that, and making yourself a person worth dating, right? Or marriageable, right? Rather than making yourself marriageable, you can always get sexual satisfaction out of porn, at least to some level, right? Which might lead to you being an incel, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, I think I got everything. So yeah, it puts negative pressure on sex and relationships and marriage rates, right? Because there's just no need for it as much. All right, I finished 3 minutes early. Okay, so again, on Monday, midterm number 2, 3 units, work, family, and sex and intimacy, which we just finished. It'll be the same arrangement, right? Come on Monday. I'll do an hour-and-a-half class starting at 1 o'clock. We'll go to 2:30, and then the time is yours after that to write your exam. I will endeavor, if I have time tomorrow, to put some example questions with an explanation in a video online because I only have 2 minutes left, but I feel like I accomplished a lot. So there we go. I'll see you on Monday.